in loving memory of Clara Bamforth and Heidi, daughter of the above, died April 5th, 1897.
I moved to Slough in 2015 with my family in Australia. The village is in a valley called the Colne Valley, just outside the town of Huddersfield, between Manchester and Leeds in West Yorkshire. And the Colne Valley was the heartland of the Industrial Revolution, and particularly the textile industry. So there's huge mills and factories which were built in the 19th century to furnish the textile industry, which are now mostly empty or fallen into disrepair. But it's also very pretty, it's very rural, green hills and stone walls and sheep. So it's kind of interesting landscape. It can be very bleak or it can be very pretty, depending on exactly where you're looking and where the light's falling. And when we arrived there, it was incredibly foreign in a way we weren't really expecting. And once I'd lived there for a few years, the place really started to get under my skin. I knew I had these kinds of ideas for songs bubbling away somewhere, and I just had this feeling I had to go outside to kind of unleash them. So it sounds a little bit far-fetched in some ways, but I really felt like the melodies were kind of, in some ways, coming through the earth and the landscape.
I find myself like whistling or singing tunes as I'm walking, and you start to wonder whether those improvised little whistlings are somehow affected perhaps by the hills around you, or whether the folk music that is coming out of those places has the beautiful kind of form to the melody, whether that is part of the landscape.
The songs are kind of often loosely based on kids from the school or neighbours' kids and stories they told. Like for instance, the song The German Sea is a neighbour from a few doors down from us, and his hilarious / gothic story about going on a seaside holiday and getting bitten by a squirrel and just having a kind of a miserable time, but also having a magical child time too. I guess it's about those kind of holidays gone wrong, or those failed holidays.
10 nights in a caravan down by the German Sea. My father said this was a special holiday for me.
I got quite into British Isles folk music while living in Slough, but I also started going a lot to our local folk night at the pub, and everyone taking in turns to kind of perform a song. And it was stuff you've heard, but there's also things like someone would sing a song about a mining disaster in Sheffield in the 19th century, and then someone stood up and recited a piece of verse about a man racing a tram, in the early 20th century. And it was just really fascinating to me that these stories and this folklore was just sort of sitting around in the community and the landscape was kind of bubbling up. And it felt to me like it was kind of a resource that was sitting there that could be used in new ways. Like the story that became the song The Linthwaite Houdini, which was a true story about a man who buried himself alive as a kind of event at the village fete, in a way that sounds like it happened in the 19th century but actually happened in 2015.
I told him it's not too late to stop it. He lay under a blanket to demonstrate the air pockets.
The concept of the album is to channel some ideas of British Isles folk music through distorted, noisy rock and roll. So trying to keep some melodic ideas of folk music and some of the instrumentation, like Northumbrian bagpipes and tin whistle. And the lyrics are kind of about, I guess, life in a 21st century English village, but also about how the past of those villages is present. So the songs are sort of almost simultaneously set in the 17th century and the 21st century.
As I walked out one summer's morn, I heard the thrushes singing. As I came over the top of Carp Hill, I felt the valley lifting.
Strange Fish is based around the idea of the single folk singer standing up in the pub and performing a song, but rather than being a song about working on a fishing boat in the 16th century or whatever, it's about a guy who runs a corner shop in our village in the 21st century. But it's also about the feeling of being a fish out of water and a strange fish, which I suppose was part of me. The other thing I guess I tried to do was think about the ways in which there are musical similarities between cultures. I knew I wanted to get MohammadReza to play on the record, and MohammadReza had arrived in Huddersfield from Iran about 5 years previously, and it turned out he was a musician, and he played the neyanban, which is the Persian bagpipe, and the dammam, which is a Persian drum, as well as the ney, the flute.
The neyanban, this is very old instrument from Iran, and maybe almost 3,000 years history and it's very simple, made of goat skin and pipe with reed. We call this dammam. This is originally from the African countries with the sailor songs and sea shanties. Usually this instrument played with the native sailors.
To me, there seems like there's musical similarities between older forms of Persian or Arabic music and older forms of folk music. It's surprising how well they go together, I think. I think to me it's largely to do with the idea of the drone, the idea of staying around a single note and seeing what you can do with that. And I use a lot of alternate tunings on the guitar, which also rely on the idea of drones. So it felt like with the bagpipes and my kind of guitar tunings and the drone-y feel of a lot of UK folk music, it seems like we had something. So Dark Red Blood is probably the song that most obviously encapsulates how we were trying to bridge a world which incorporated traditional styles of folk music with Persian bagpipes and distorted rock music. And also it's got this whole intro section which is basically MohammadReza on the nayanban and then me playing guitar and weaving throughout him. So it's a bit of a jam as well with the two of us, which is kind of nice. I found out about Sarah, who plays the Northumbrian bagpipes, and I became very interested in the idea of having two bagpipe players on the same record, you know, one from Northern England, one from Iran. But they're very different kinds of bagpipes. The neyanban is extremely loud and very wild and rock and roll, and the Northumbrian bagpipe is very beautiful and quiet.
Most bagpipes that people are familiar with, like Highland pipes, have an open end on the chanter, so the chanter's the bit that plays the tune, which means that there's a bell note. Northumbrian pipes are different because you produce a note by lifting a finger, there is no bell note. So that means they can produce staccato sounds, which is quite unique to Northumbrian pipes.
Town Gossip was a song about a school appeal, which has got to be the most specific subject matter for a song ever. MohammadReza plays dammam, which is the Persian drum, but he also plays this beautiful ney part as well. And then Sarah played violin on this one, and just the combination of her folk fiddle with his ney, it's just a really beautiful combination.
He's my son, I know what he needs. Now they're talking about.
The first musician I played was George Harrington, who's the drummer, and we started jamming together. And it became clear as soon as I first started working with him that it was going to be a noisy, loud rock record. So we added Chris Ruffoni, who plays bass, but he's also, as I discovered, a really fantastic arranger of brass instruments and a great trumpet player. And so he does all these beautiful brass arrangements on the record. And living in West Yorkshire, you cannot help but notice all the brass bands. They call it the Pennine Cradle, where brass banding kind of got invented, so I knew I wanted a bit of that in there.
We started with just some rehearsals, with just a few of us, and then it grew. Then going into the recording studios, we then were surrounded by all these amazing equipment and instruments. We were like, oh, we'll put a bit of that in, put a bit of this in.
Julia, it turned out, played the tin whistle, and it was just like this really great thing. It's like, of course, when you play the tin whistle, we've got to have tin whistle on the record, because that's, that's a real folk thing.
When I get home from school, my dad's already into it, wearing a white t-shirt, the word swag written across it.
Bird Boy, it's got this beautiful combination of Julia's tin whistle and Sarah's Northumbrian small pipes, and George is playing the drum kit.
Walk up to the quarry, a flurry of ground pigeons move. From under my feet, the arrival of sudden bad news.
The tom fills that follow Toby's singing, we kind of had the idea of that kind of folky, Boran kind of like sound going round on the tom, so it was kind of mimicking that.
So it's kind of almost a way it's this marrying of these two, this sort of sonic rock and roll thing with this folk thing. I felt the Valley Lifting was recorded in Sheffield just before I returned to Australia. So it was actually one of the last things I did around April, and then we left and moved back to Australia in June. The relationships you build with people through making music are kind of the most interesting thing. And I had no idea how the record would sound before we started jamming together, and I was surprised at how rocky it was actually. And if I'd been left to my own devices, it probably would have been a lot more acoustic and quiet, but it wasn't, because the people involved didn't play like that. And I'm so glad it was like that.